welcome to The Sound of Design
with Mark
and Dan. And we are very, we did it that time.
We did.
We are very, very thankful that you guys are here and joining us. So thank you so much. Go ahead and click that subscribe button and ring the bell. Do all of the things to help keep the show going. We would really, really, really appreciate it. Today, we are getting post-Thanksgiving. So we've just gone through our Black Friday experiences, and everybody's had all the turkey, and you're sitting down, and you're thinking about what to get for Christmas, and in your mind, you don't know it yet, but you've imagined that there is a surround sound system in your future. So we've thought it might be a good idea to do a whole episode dedicated to audio video receivers, or AVRs. So we're going to talk about inputs and outputs. We're going to talk about some of their key technologies. We're going to talk about the differences. We're going to talk about some of the applications, why you might go this direction or that direction. And so you'll get everything that you could possibly need to know so you don't make the mistake when it comes to getting your AVR. We don't want there to be any major issues. We want you to be able to get the right one for you. So, without further ado, Mark.
Dan.
Let's say that I'm looking for an AVR. I just want to do something entry level, and I walk in to a showroom, and I see 10 of them. What is the first thing that I should be looking for when I'm looking at an AVR?
Well, as we've kind of talked about in previous episodes, the first thing that I'm going to recommend, or that you should be looking for, is something that's going to have a minimum of 7 channels. And the reason why I would recommend that is because of Dolby Atmos, which is one of the multiple sound processing codecs that are available in most content today. If you buy a 5-channel receiver, you can't really do full Atmos with that. So your first option should be, hey, I need to be looking at a 7-channel receiver. Past that, there's a lot more to kind of take into account based on, a lot of different variables. So, as we've talked about earlier, what kind of speakers are you powering? Are you going to be purchasing speakers? Do you have your eye on something that's in the future? Maybe not in the near future, but maybe a year from now. A lot of those things really need to be taken into account when you're looking at a new AV receiver.
I love it. And I'm glad you started there, because it's the biggest number that you see on the box, right? Is it 5.1 or 7.2 or 9 point whatever? And so, I think the first thing that you want to call out is it's the number of speakers that you're going to drive from that receiver, right? How many speakers are we going to hook up? And if you only had, for example, 2 speakers, you can hook up 2 speakers to a receiver that powers 7. You just don't use 5 of the channels. You could hook up 3 speakers to a 9-channel receiver. You're just not going to use those additional channels. So it only plays back whatever is connected to it. If you don't have a center channel, it doesn't send out energy to the center channel, right?
Right.
So, all right. So we pick the number of speakers, and we look at that. You mentioned, are you going to be purchasing speakers? So is there kind of like maybe like a food and a wine pairing? Is there maybe a way that you could think about a receiver and a speaker as a combination? Is that really a thing, or am I kind of getting off base there?
No, it's definitely a thing. Before I get started, there's obviously any receiver is going to power a speaker. So I'm not here to tell you that a $300 or $400 receiver isn't going to make sound come out of a whatever the cost speaker that you plug it into, it will. It just depends on, that speaker is going to be dependent on, how much volume you're going to have to turn up on the receiver. That's where it comes down to things like wattage and noise and other things that you've got to take into account. So when you say, is there a pairing? I would say absolutely. Typically, in a lot of homes that we're doing today, even with surround sound, architectural is a big focus for a lot of folks. So a lot of times people say, oh, it's in the wall, it's in the ceiling, I don't need a ton of power, I'm going to cut down to this $480 Denon receiver because, it's just in ceiling, right? I don't need a lot of power. Well, are we powering contractor grade speakers, or are we powering KEF in ceiling speakers? Which, if you don't know KEF, watch one of our previous episodes. But they're fairly they like a lot of power.
Yeah.
So if I plug a better receiver into that KEF speaker, I'm not asking the receiver to work as hard to push the correct amount of output to that speaker, if that makes sense.
Yep, I think so. And we're using the term, so we might as well go ahead and start clarifying some of them. And the first one I think is wattage, right? So
Yep.
Wattage is that power rating. And when you look at the back of a receiver, not on the box, and we'll just call it out again. Common misconception, common mistake that everybody makes. You look at a box that says this receiver for $200 makes 1,000 watts. That is not true. Look at the power supply on the back of it, and it'll tell you the actual number, 280 watts or 430 or however many watts there are. And I think the other common misconception is that more power means more volume. And I think that's the other thing that I would call out when we kind of say that. Just because you have a receiver that has more wattage doesn't mean that you're going to listen to it louder, but rather it will be clearer at a lower volume level. And so it's one of those really important things, and we can't say it enough. We'll sound like broken records and say this till we die. You have to think about that power rating in conjunction with what speaker you're going to pick. And to your point, if you have a power hungry speaker, it's not necessarily super efficient. That better power is going to be a better match for that speaker. And I think it's probably also fair to say that different kinds of speakers are designed for different purposes and different kinds of sound qualities or tonality, or to use the technical term, have different timbre, right? And so all of them are going to give you the ability to pair a receiver with it. So if you have a very efficient speaker, something that doesn't require a lot of power, well, then it doesn't necessarily mean that you want to go to a less expensive unit. It just means that the power requirement may not be as great as it would be with another brand. And so you got to pick and choose. Some very expensive receivers don't have a ton of wattage, but they do a lot of other things really, really well. And so it's like you have to look at this as part of a puzzle, right? So, all right, we've covered wattage. Okay, so let's think about that for one part of our puzzle piece. We've talked about number of speakers. So let's maybe kind of talk through a little bit what would be the next thing that we need to look at on a receiver that should come into consideration. What do we need to check for to make sure that we're getting what it is that we need?
Sure. So I know this is going to come as a surprise to some folks, but there are still people that utilize multiple devices that connect to a system, like a Blu-ray player or 4K Blu-ray player, or a gaming system. It's not just streaming from the television. No hate there, just, a lot of folks, I think, look at it as, oh, I only need this one thing. Not necessarily the case. I have, in my system, my receiver has, our processor has 7 HDMI inputs. I utilize all of them. If I could buy a processor / receiver that had more, I would probably do it, because I like to have all of the video game systems hooked up at the same time because that's who I am. So the point I'm getting to is we need to make sure it's got the right inputs and maybe audio outputs depending on what functionality you're looking for to fit your system. So how many HDMIs do I need? If I've got a legacy component like a VCR or a Nintendo 64 or something along those lines, does this receiver have a component or composite video inputs and the ability to upscale through HDMI, or do I got to run separate video to my display for that? And a big one that's really come on in the past several years as turntables have gotten more and more popular again is a phono input. Does it have a built-in phono stage, or do I need a separate phono preamp for my turntable? So inputs, outputs, those are very important.
Yep, absolutely. And I like the way you said it too, which is it's based upon what you're going to connect into your system, right? And so this question is really one that you have to answer yourself. You don't know until you start looking at your devices and saying, okay, what am I going to connect? And there's, I think, again, this misconception, well, I'm just going to stream. It's like, well, right, until you want to watch family movies, or you want to play some video games, or you want to listen to music, or and like in one instance, you're going like, oh, right, yeah, we want to maybe think about this as a longer term purchase. And if we're thinking about this, right, what am I going to connect? You're not answering it for today. You're answering it for the next 5 to 10 years. If you run a receiver, okay, or an AVR like this, the right way, it can last a long time. It can serve you and your family really, really well. So when you think about that, don't pigeonhole yourself and make yourself stuck by buying a receiver that doesn't give you some flexibility. That's kind of the whole point, right? Is to be able to maybe do some different things, not just today, but a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. Maybe I do want to play or hook up a video game. If my kid is 11, maybe they're playing a lot of video games, right? But if my kid is 9, maybe not as many. But in a couple of years, yep, that's going to be part of the family routine. Yeah, maybe we should really, think that through and make sure that we're good to go, in long into the future.
Yeah, yeah, and just to kind of roll up behind that, like one thing that you really want to make sure of is if you are going to be buying a receiver that's going to be, let's say, a new PlayStation 5 or Series X Xbox is going to be connected to it, make sure it's got enough what's going to be labeled as 8K HDMI ports on the back, but something that can support 4K at 120 hertz. Otherwise, like mine, I only have one, so I had to run separate HDMIs on my display still because I've got multiple systems that can do that. So
I'm so glad you said it. Yes.
yeah, and it really is a problem. Like I'm like, there are two competitors out there. Come on, guys, like that do this. Why would you only put one HDMI port on your receiver to do that? Now, a lot of receivers have since COVID really stepped their game up and brought out those, but there are a couple of outliers that still might only have one 8K or 4K 120 hertz capable port.
Yeah, and this is, albeit a niche kind of a conversation, but for the heavier tech user, right, where, again, let's say you run both consoles, you really do need to kind of think through your system design and layout to make sure that you've got everything running the way that you're supposed to. And is there a workaround? Absolutely. I get it. You could run your PS5 directly to your TV, and then you could connect your TV back to your receiver using an optical port. But are you going to get Dolby Atmos if you do that?
No,
you're not, actually. And so before you know it, you've cut your audio performance off at the knees because we didn't think through the inputs and outputs, and we didn't think through what was going to be connected. And so I think it's really important to kind of dive a little bit deeper, take some time, and think through your system layout to make sure that you're connecting everything that you need to. I'd also like to mention, because you mentioned turntables, and I know a lot of folks are bringing back the turntable, and this happens all the time. somebody will buy a turntable, they'll plug it into a receiver, and they turn it up, and it sounds distorted, and it sounds weird and gross. And they come into the store, and they're like, hey, my turntable is broken, or my receiver is broken. It's like, hold up. Is it really broken? Or did we maybe not connect this correctly? And the answer is 9 times out of 10, we just didn't connect it the right way. So we'll talk more about turntables a little bit later, I'm sure. But they have what's called a phono level output, or they have what's called a line level output. And so there's 2 kinds, right? So if you have a phono level output, the volume on that is so low that you plug it in, you turn up the amp, and all you hear is the noise, because that's really all you're turning up, is you're just turning up more noise that the electronics themselves are introducing. So for turntables, they have this thing called the phono preamplifier, and that phono preamplifier takes just the signal and turns it up, and it leaves the noise in the dust, so you don't have to worry about it. So you have to decide, and you have to double check, does your turntable have one built in, or does it not? If it doesn't have one built in, then you need to hook it up to the phono connection on your receiver. If it does have one built in, then you need to hook it up to a regular connection on your receiver, labeled CD or cable or whatever. It doesn't matter what the label is. It all means the same thing in the end, except for phono. So just remember that if you're connecting a turntable, you got to know which one is which. Otherwise, it's not going to sound right when you turn it on. So
I'm glad you called out the phono to phono connection, because I've had clients do the same thing, and 2 phonos don't make a right. We'll just put it that way. Like,
oh my goodness. Oh, that's terrible and awesome at the same time.
it really doesn't. It's just gonna amplify the noise, and it's gonna be nasty, and you won't be happy. So listen to Dan's words.
There you go. All right, so we've talked a little bit about HDMI connections and the phono connection, and I'll just maybe go before we jump on to the next thing. I keep noticing on all of these, there's these labels above each one of those HDMI inputs. Do they actually mean you got to plug in that device into that thing, or does it not matter, Mark?
I mean, yes, you absolutely have. No, not at all. It doesn't matter. And in most cases, if it's somebody who's installing this for you and they aren't labeling those with what's connected, you need to be asking them to do that, because ultimately it's going to make your life and their life easier should they ever have to troubleshoot something, because they know, hey, I've got it, on this input, and it's, it might be media player, but maybe you have your Xbox plugged into it. They know, hey, this is the HDMI, I now get to troubleshoot, versus, just the generic, okay, which HDMI, especially if you use 8 of the same HDMI cable and they didn't label it, it's a lot more difficult to troubleshoot, especially if you're someone coming in after the fact. So, or yourself, if you like to tinker around like that. Labeling up front will save you a lot of time and effort.
Yep. And I do think it's important, because this is one of those things I've had to do when an HDMI board starts acting wonky, which it can happen, right? Mm-hmm. It's not every receiver every time, but it happens enough that, you get a power surge, and let's say you're not connected to a Furman or, an Audio Quest or something like that that's going to help protect the gear. And that HDMI port, let's say it goes out. Well, just because your cable box, for example, was plugged into the cable box input doesn't mean it has to be plugged into that one. You could go right next to it and plug it into DVD, or right next to it and plug it into Blu-ray, or right next to it and plug it into, one of those other HDMI ports. And they're all going to work the same way for generic video sources. Again, video game console, different conversation, but everything else, it does not matter, right? So,
right.
Now we kind of have a good idea about HDMI inputs. So there's one output. So can you walk us through maybe the signal flow or the connection diagram and that we would want to use for most systems with a TV or a projector, so we get the video source and the video output connected the right way.
Sure. So you'd pick a source, right? So cable box, Apple TV, Blu-ray player, gaming system. All of those are going to connect to the same ports on the back of your receiver. So those are going to be connected to the in ports on your receiver. So go out of your device with an HDMI cable into that. Now, say you got 4 devices, get them all plugged in. That is then going to separate the audio and the video at the receiver on the board. So it's going to send the audio to the amplifiers based on whatever receiver you have, and it's going to come out of the speaker outputs or the pre-outputs, which we can get to in a minute. And then it's going to split the video and go to the HDMI out. You're then going to run an HDMI cable from the output to your display. Display meaning projector, television, monitor, whatever it is that you're using. When you want to switch, you're going to switch inputs on the receiver itself. So that's where the labeling comes in. So you don't want to be going through, switching inputs and go, all right, where did I plug my Apple TV in? Is that a media player or game 1 or aux 1? Oh no, I just know exactly where I need to turn it on the receiver itself, if you're not using a control system of some sort. But that's going to then switch the inputs on the receiver to, split the right video and audio to the proper areas. I brought up pre-outs a second ago. That's also where your subwoofer connects. Your subwoofer is typically a separate powered speaker. All of your other speakers are passive, so you utilize the amplifier built into your receiver. The amplifiers built into the receiver. The subwoofer uses that line level signal or line out. So you'll go AVR from the AVR from one of the subwoofer pre-outs to your sub, and then adjust your subwoofer volume however you want. Yep.
Well, and I really appreciate the in-depth breakdown because it's saying, cable box into receiver and then receiver out to TV. That's how you got to think about it. It's just, and that's kind of where the receiver got its name. Like it's receiving signal, right? And that's kind of the whole point of this device is to give us the ability to do more than one thing at a time, so to speak. I want to be able to connect multiple devices. So this I think should all make pretty good sense. And you brought up the pre-outs, and so I think it's really awesome that you mentioned the subwoofer because a lot of folks I think will have an old subwoofer sitting around, like from an old Bose system, or maybe you have one from your car stereo days or something along those lines, and people are looking for a way to connect that to the receiver, and it's like it doesn't do that. All the other speakers are fine. Your subwoofer is in a world unto itself, right? And that's because it plugs into the wall, gets its own power. So, all right. So we've got HDMI out to the display. So that's television or projector. Doesn't really matter which. So all that inputs and outputs should make sense. Talk to me a little bit, because we've brought it up 3-4 times, what a pre-out is, and does that happen on just any receiver, or do you have to have a special kind of or special model of receiver?
Yeah. So it just depends on what pre-outs you're looking for, and what I mean by that is obviously there's not an AV receiver out there that does multi-channels that won't have a subwoofer pre-out. So you're always going to have that. Where other ones can come in is when it comes to either multiple zones. So if you have surround sound in a living space or in a theater and there's a bar or an outdoor space that's attached or adjacent to that has 2 speakers, but with another amplifier, you would utilize the zone 2 or zone 3 pre-output, which is typically left and right stereo, to a secondary amplifier which would power that zone. The other pre-outs, which are very specific typically to your mid-tier and higher performance receivers are pre-outs for up to typically 11 to 13 to even 15 channels of processing, to where, let's say you had a really nice pair, or buying a really nice pair of speakers to add to this receiver a year later, but you know that the receiver was only 125 watts and your speakers really need 300 to 400 watts of power. You could utilize the front, left, and right pre-out of the receiver to run to that second amp. And that way, now you're sending the right amount of power to those speakers. You're sending that 300 or 400 watts versus the 125 watts. And at that point, you're going to disconnect the speaker wire from the amplifier or the speaker wire terminals on the receiver and utilize those pre-outs, which are just going to look like RCA, to run that signal to a secondary amplifier or amplifiers, depending on, again, the performance you're looking for.
Yep, absolutely. And I appreciate that most folks at this point, your eyes have glazed over because the technical language. You're like, what's he talking about? Pre-outs and all this. It's just the way I want to kind of translate a little bit for you is to say, just think about how many rooms you've got. When we say zones, we're really thinking about rooms. And when we say the word amps, we're really talking about engines for speakers. So if speakers are the tires, right, then the engine for that is an amplifier. And I think where a lot of folks get confused and where it gets really murky is that the receiver does too many things. It does a ton of stuff. And so it's very easy for us to be like, well, it's too hard. I just don't want to deal with it. And so we won't go down that way. So you know what? Why don't I just throw a soundbar on there? It's like, yeah, but now you've cut off your performance and you've eliminated yourself from the best audio quality that you could get because we didn't take a few minutes to just sort of figure out, well, what do we really need to do? Or just find someone who already knows. So work with your integrator, work with a designer. Like, if you don't care, great. Hire me. I'll tell you, it's easy for me. I've been doing it for a decade. Like, it doesn't matter. So, shameless plug. If you don't want to deal with it, hire it out, and we'll figure it out for you. All right. So, if you're a do-it-yourselfer, and we talk about pre-outs, again, line level signal, not speaker level signal, and we're going to other rooms, or we're doing multi-channel audio, so that would be like your surround formats and your Dolby Atmos formats and things like that. It sounds like you kind of have some versatility. So it in one sense, a receiver could be used for surround sound, but at the same time, you just said that it can also do multiple zones of audio as well. So what do I need to look for to tell the difference between the purpose? If I just want music in a lot of rooms, do I buy a receiver? Or if I just want, right? Or if I want to do, just a couple stereo speakers, what do I buy for that? I mean, and so I think it's very easy to kind of get some of the things confused. And so just help me understand, like, the difference between distributed audio and maybe surround sound, and just touch on that real briefly. Yeah. So actually, funny enough, I was in the store yesterday, and we had a client walk in, and he had talked to one of the newer folks that we have working with us right now, and they were like, hey, he's asking questions about multiple rooms, but he's looking at a receiver. Like, what's can you come out here? And I'm like, sure. I've got a little bit before I've got to get to one of my appointments. I'll come out there and help you. So I go out there, and it was exactly this. This guy, he's got 3 or 4 zones of audio. I want to say it was four zones, so 2 speakers in each room, and the receiver died on Thanksgiving. Oh, man.
Yep.
Talk about spoil your holiday.
Yeah. And now this is like 20-something years old is what he said. Like, he bought it, well, it wasn't that long. Let's see. He said he bought it in 2010, I think, 2009, 2010. So still 15 years old. We'll call it 15 years, right? And, you and I know, we've been here long enough. Immediately, I know exactly how this guy's got it hooked up, because he's like, I've got this same looking thing and it comes out to a box, and then that box goes to the speakers, and I can click buttons and make sound work. And I'm like, well, hey, really, this guy here nowadays, especially, I mean, 15 years ago, it was probably made a little bit better. We can confidently say that. But this guy here really isn't designed at all to do what you're doing. What I mean is that he's got a AV receiver that's, he's looking at one that was like 60 watts a channel. That's an 8 ohm receiver. And he's got 2 wires run to a speaker selector with 8 speakers connected to it. So you're asking that receiver's 2 channels to power 4 times what it's supposed to do.
That sounds like hauling with a Honda Civic.
Yeah, it's very, very much so. So instead of it getting its proper ohm load, which is 8 ohms, it's now at 1 ohm per channel because I've divided it in half every time I've added another speaker. So really, he needed what we call a distributed audio amplifier, which is an amp that is designed to power multiple zones of audio at 50 watts a channel or 100 watts per channel or whatever it is that you want based on the quality of sound and functionality that you need. Now, those wattage conversations go back to what we started here at the beginning. What kind of speaker am I powering? How much power do they want? Blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, if you're doing multiple rooms of audio, a receiver, even if you hook all of the speakers up and do multi-channel stereo, isn't truly designed for that. It's designed to send the proper amount of signal to multiple channels at the proper times. It's not meant to send the same amount of signal to all of its channels all of the time.
Yep.
You're going to end up burning it out, and you're going to end up replacing it a lot sooner, especially nowadays. Nothing against any of our vendors. Obviously, things have gotten less expensive to purchase, so it costs them less. They're using a little bit cheaper parts. It's the world we live in.
Yeah.
But not to be too long-winded, but truly, if you're going to be doing multiple rooms of audio, you don't want to use your receiver to do all of that.
Yep. And I'm really glad you said it that way, and you took us down the distributed audio rabbit trail, because I think that there's this misconception, there's this problem that happens in our minds where it's like, well, can't I make it work? And will say this again till we're blue in the face. If just because you can make something work doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. We should be thinking about, well, what should I do? Because this is a long-term purchase. So if you take your receiver and you hook it up the wrong way and you burn it out in 2 years, well, that was a waste of money. And what are you going to do? You're going to go back to the store and you're like, oh, I'll just buy another one. It's like, okay. So you keep buying the wrong thing over and over and over again. And it's like, nobody wants to do that. Please just don't do that. Yep. Buy the thing that is supposed to go for the thing that you're trying to do.
And this might be controversial, but a lot of times doing the wrong thing makes you go back and do the wrong thing again. And you're really not buying what you should. So then in your head, you're thinking, this isn't as good a quality now, so I'm just not going to spend the money on something nicer. When something nicer would probably do it for you, and you wouldn't be back in the store to waste that time and money, if that makes sense. Yep. And again, not to be controversial to push anyone's buttons, but really, there are things in technology that it's worth to spend the extra money to do it right the first time. That is a slogan that Dan and I and other colleagues have just, pushed down everyone else's throat to be as straightforward as possible. Like, doing it right the first time, even if it's a little bit more or a lot of bit more, it depends on what you're wanting, is going to make the experience better for you, and you won't have to worry about coming in 2 years to replace it.
Yep. And I think that's really the difference in the game, right? It's like, you can get a hamburger from McDonald's. Nothing wrong with a hamburger with McDonald's. But if that's all you ate, wasn't there a documentary, right, about the detrimental effects of doing the wrong thing over and over? Every once in a while, all right, not a big deal, but, definitely not a daily practice. And I think, the same holds true for audio equipment. So, all right, well, we've gone off a little bit of a tangent, so we're going to get back on track a little bit because we now have, I think, a clear purpose, which is we look at a receiver and it says 7 channels and 2 zones. So we know that we have our main purpose is really video integration. So I think that's kind of to sum up what we've been saying. If you have a TV or a projector, then yeah, we need an AV receiver. That makes sense. If we're just doing music, that's a different conversation. We should do that thing over there. So let's go to the scenario where I have, say, more than 7 channels. Like we have a dedicated media room or a theater room or something like that we're going to use. And we want to have 9 speakers or 11 speakers, do a proper, Dolby Atmos style room. What do I need to watch out for receivers in that category? Because they're going to be a little nicer. Okay. So now you're in that, $1,500 to $2,000 kind of a range, $3,000, $4,000, depending on the manufacturer and what you want it to do. So this is going to be a bigger investment. What do we need to make sure we are really checking to make sure that is the best choice possible?
Sure. So this is really where, those pre-outs, in my opinion, are going to come into play. And I'm not saying that you're going to need separate amps across the whole board, but we're going to kind of get to that. So typically when you're doing that many channels, you're going to be looking at a 9 or an 11 or 13 channel receiver. And that's great for an all-in-one solution. But it might not be the best for the speakers that you're choosing. So what I'm getting at is one of the projects I've talked about on the podcast before. Client has 5 ear level speakers and 4 in-ceiling speakers with 4 subwoofers. Okay. The in-ceiling speakers are $2,500 ish a piece, so they're pretty nice. The ear level speakers are $10,000 a piece.
Wow.
So now I have 9 speakers. I could buy the Marantz Cinema 40 and power those today. But what's going to happen as I turn the volume up and try to get that experience that I'm looking for, I'm going to have to push it really hard. I'm probably getting up to 80 or 90 on the volume scale of 0 to 100 before I'm really feeling anything, and it's probably pretty noisy because I'm asking that receiver to do all of the work with the video, with the audio, and all of the other components inside of it, just bringing out that noise. So that's where I would utilize separate amplifiers, or in some cases, a separate preamp processor versus an AV receiver. That's going to look like an AV receiver from the front, but when you turn it around, you'll notice that it's missing speaker terminals, and it's going to have XLR and RCA in its place. And that means that it's going to take the amplification completely out of that box and allow you to then purchase the proper amplifiers for the amount of speakers that you have. So that client I just mentioned has 9 Macintosh MC611 amplifiers. So a little over 600 watts a channel per speaker times 9.
I can't count that high.
I was just at his house last week. I go over there all the time. He wants us to film some stuff in his home. So we'll be out there probably in the next month or so. He didn't want to be in the video, but he definitely wants us to be out there. But that being said, he only has to turn it to like 45, 50 before it's like there's a space shuttle going off in this room. Like it's the whole system. It just, you feel the sound, and there's no noise in that. He can actually turn it down to like 30 at night and hear what everyone's saying and not be waking his family up upstairs or bothering them if they're watching TV in another room, because the whole house is kind of open to itself.
Yep.
Well, so
I think it makes sense, because you're saying, we need to make sure we have enough power to match the speaker. And that's kind of really going back to our previous thread. It's the concept of matching, right? Just like food and wine. Like I got to have a pairing. So I got to think about, how am I going to pair this unit with the speakers that I have? And knowing what the correct ohm load is, knowing what type of power handling they have, knowing are they going to be efficient or not efficient, like those things are going to play into the buying decision, right? And the design choice that we have to make. I think it's fair to say that we wouldn't expect a $200 unit to drive $50,000 worth of speakers. In fact, just saying it out loud, it's ludicrous on its face. It's like, no, that $200 receiver is not going to work here. Like, we need to look at something else. But at the same time, let's say you have those contractor grade speakers and we're starting out and it's our first system and, it's your first home and, we want to do surround sound, but we don't have 50 grand to spend. We have 5. Okay. Well, you know what? Maybe we should look at an all-in-one. Maybe we should look at, and so you're just trying to match that speaker to the receiver, right? You're trying to find that correct pairing. And once, and if you're not sure, really the best thing to do, honestly, is to grab a designer, grab somebody who knows with a model number and say, hey, this is what it is. The amazing thing about technology today from internet search perspective is like we have access now to technical specs for gear for the last like 20 years. So I can't tell you the number of times I walk into somebody's house and they're like, I don't know what this is. And it's like, okay, well, let's take the cover off. Let's take a look at what's going on, or let's look at the back and let's find a model number. And a quick Google search, later, and you're going like, oh, it's this really nice Vienna acoustics, and it's got this type of wattage handling, and it's going to have these types of connections on the back, and it's going to be compatible with these types of receivers. And, you don't realize it, but that was a really nice pair of speakers in its day, and even for today, right? You may consider doing something like a nicer Marantz or a nicer Denon or something like that. And not to disparage other companies, but just to say we do a lot of their stuff, and they tend to do very well. So what are, as we kind of, we've teased a little bit into separates. And so I think it's fair to say that once you've paired the correct performance level, number of speakers, we've thought through all the different connections, and what we're going to connect to it and all that kind of stuff. So all that stuff has now kind of been taken into consideration. There's all sorts of weird stuff that I see on these things, and I just don't understand what a lot of it means, right? So, I see things like, hyperdynamic amplifier modules and, pure direct mode and toroidal power supplies and, things along those lines. Do I have to worry about a lot of that stuff? Is that going to make a huge difference in my sound, or, is this more just like technobabble?
I mean, obviously everyone's going to have their differentiators, right? So you brought up the hyperdynamic amplifier module. That's something that's exclusive to Marantz products, and they developed that technology a long time ago. Realistically, that, in my opinion, is a big differentiator. It makes their receivers more efficient. So, let's say they advertise a certain amount of wattage. That makes that receiver 70% efficient, meaning that it's never going to go below 70% of that advertised wattage at however many watts per channel that it's advertising. So if it says it's 100 watts per channel with all channels driven, you're going to never go below 70 watts a channel with everything running at the same time. That's a big deal. And that's ultimately why you'd pay for a Marantz over their sister company, Denon. It's typically about $1,000, $500 to $1,000 difference, and but with Denon, you might be getting 50%, you might be getting 40%, depending on which one you're buying. Typically, their In Command series or X series models are a little bit better, but still, that is something you want to pay attention to. Now, things like Dolby Atmos and this, that, and the other. Obviously, yes, it's important based on some of the other factors we were talking about. But, the only other thing I would look for is, and it's very important based on the room that you're putting in, is what type of calibration is offered on the receiver you're looking at.
Yep, absolutely.
So if it's Marantz or Denon, they are going to use Odyssey. Different levels of Odyssey depending on which model you're going with, and some of the higher end Marantz also has Dirac or Dirac, however you want to say it. which is the same calibration that is offered on JBL and Arcam.
Yep.
And in my opinion, just my opinion, probably some of the best calibration software out there.
Yep, and I would agree with you. There are some others, Room Perfect being one, and there are some real high end calibration softwares that are out there. But I think it's important to maybe sum up. Just because you don't understand what maybe one of those things is, you have to ask: is that a brand specific technology, right? That's being a differentiator, or is that a technology that everybody has to kind of fall in line with? Is this one that I have to worry about, is only available on this unit? Well, then that's going to be, in my opinion, not a secondary technology in the sense that it's worth less, but rather I have to just put it in its own category. I have to say that's only available in this line. Great. Awesome. So we can learn about that, and that'll make sense for those guys. These guys over here are going to have something different. Yamaha does their own variation on calibration. YPOW, I think is the way that's called. And it does a great job. It's awesome. Does that mean that it's better or worse then? Well, you got to listen to them. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of folks are able to just buy a receiver and listen to the calibration technology, right? Like, I'm sorry, until you do, a couple thousand systems, like you don't really know until you start listening. You can say, oh, this is how this one works and this is how that one works. So I would just say you want to maybe put that in a special category and understand, like, there's really not a fair way to judge some of those things as the end consumer. So again, work with your designer. Ask the question, what do you like? What have you seen in the field? What are some of the things that you experience when you're doing these things? And when you start hearing people say, yeah, Dirac or Dirac is awesome, and, it's not to say that Odyssey was bad. It just means that, this other one might be better, or Room Perfect, right? Macintosh uses that, and some of the other high-end brands will use that as well. That's going to be even better than, right? Well, why? Well, there's a better chip. There's a better processor. It recognizes a lot more information. It has more headroom. It has all these other things that are going to lead to a better audio experience for you as the end user. And so we just want to make sure, right, that we're advising folks to maybe make those decisions fully informed. And until you actually ask some opinions and maybe get 2 or 3 opinions and say, yeah, everybody seems on this consensus, this seems to make the most sense. You have to kind of go with a little bit of groupthink in this particular case, because it's so hard to really judge fairly in a lot of cases. And I bring this up, I think, a little bit as a pet peeve, because I'm so frustrated about people arguing online all the time, okay, using this microphone to test this thing. And it's like, man, there are so many variables that are going into this that at a certain point you have to look at it and say, your specs aren't real. Like, I wish that they were, but you got to toss them out. Like, they're like the numbers that's, an NFL player has at the combine, I think is the best way to say this, right? Like, I understand he's 6'8". I understand he runs a 4.4. I understand that he seems pretty accurate, but there's no substitute for being able to actually play the game, right? Just because it looks good on a scorecard, and those things are real and they are important, that's just not the whole story. So, like, let's have that conversation to make sure that we're having the whole conversation, not just part of the conversation.
Right.
All right. So we've talked a little bit about some of the extra stuff. What else do we need to look for when it comes to integration specifically? A lot of our customers, they don't want to have to deal with any of this. And if they've made it to the end of the episode, I'd be amazed. So if you're
I'm sure we've got some loyal listeners that are still here, Dan. It's all good.
Still
We're
hanging
here
out
to help you. Hey,
for those of you who are
what?
here, thanks.
Yeah, honestly though, like, really, that's why we exist. I mean, we're trying to make it easy for you all, but please, like, we like talking this stuff to everybody. So let us help you, not to do a shameless plug, but that's what we're here for. So if this is getting a little complex still, reach out to Dan or myself and we'll help you out. But go ahead. I interrupted your perfectly thought out question.
Yeah. Which was to say, how do we need to look at integration with a control system and with other devices? What are the things we're going to look for? Like I see 12-volt triggers, and I see RS-232, especially on some of those nicer models. What does that stuff mean, and why do I care about it?
Yeah. So while you and I love what receivers do because they're like the brain of a lot of the systems that we design, they're not the prettiest things to most people because it's just a big box, black or silver box that's going to sit, that you would have to sit out in the middle of the room and look at every day. And while you and I could appreciate it, most people don't. So we want to hide this thing. So we'll hide it in a rack or in a piece of furniture or something along those lines, meaning now we've got to be able to control it. Your higher end receivers are going to have that serial or RS-232 data connection on the back of it. It's going to look like a reverse VGA connection, if you're familiar with the VGA port.
It's got it's like old computer cables, right?
Yeah, yep. It's got the little two screws with like the, whatever. And then, so you've got that option. You've got a network connection, which means most control systems can control things over IP. So it uses that specific receiver's network IP address to send it on, off, input switch commands. And then IR is available on any of them, but that's a line of sight. Typically, if you're hiding it somewhere, you have to put a little eye on it, which can come unglued or be knocked off when you're dusting or whatever, just fall off randomly. So it's usually not the most reliable. So networking and network IP and RS-232 are very important. And then you brought up the 12-volt triggers. Those are typically utilized to control secondary devices like additional amplifiers. So I have a Macintosh amp that's powering my two front speakers. When I turn the receiver on, I don't want to have to go to the Macintosh amp and turn the knob separately. I can have the receiver send a 12-volt signal to trigger that over a stereo, what you would call an auxiliary cable, but a TRS cable. 3.5 millimeter. Or I could have it trigger a projector screen or something along those lines. So typically things that, give me a secondary form of control to control multiple devices when the receiver turns on, which is pretty awesome, honestly.
Well, and I'm sure people will remember, if you've had a receiver from 20 years ago or 30 years ago, they used to have power outlets on them, right? And so it's one of those things where like you could turn the receiver on and then the devices that were connected to it would automatically click on. It wasn't a bad strategy. I just don't think it was ultimately the right execution. So today, like, we don't have power outlets on the back of a receiver anymore. You have these triggers, and to your point, like, you just plug a wire in and it'll click on the next device. And so that makes it really easy to turn on lots of pieces of gear all at the same time, or to turn off a bunch of gear all at the same time. You turn the receiver off and the screen retracts back into the ceiling and the projector turns off and your amplifiers turn off and all those kinds of things. And so you start thinking about some of those nicer receivers, and I have 3 12-volt triggers on it. Well, why? Well, because in a dedicated theater, I have a screen, a projector, and an additional amplifier. Then guess what? I'm going to need at least 3 12-volt triggers to run those 3 devices, right? And so it's not rocket science in one sense, but if you don't know what it's there for, then you don't know how to really, hook all that stuff up. They just become, extra or unused ports. So you don't really get all the options that you need. And likewise, if you don't have a screen and you don't have another amp and you don't have a projector, I don't need the 12-volt triggers. So I'm buying technology I may not necessarily need. So you just want to think through again, work with your designer and let's ask all the right questions. It doesn't take that long. Once you get through it, then you pick the right one. Then you're off to the races. So. All right. Well, we have covered a ton on AVRs. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you feel like we really should? And there's maybe one or two things I can think of, but we've covered quite a bit.
You know, the one thing that I point out with a lot of receivers is a lot of them have added Bluetooth and Wi-Fi functionality for music playback.
Yep.
That's great. But I usually would recommend don't necessarily shop a receiver just because of that, because there are devices that do it better. And maybe that's just me standing on a pedestal for a second. But you know, if you're ultimately looking at getting the best sound quality for music out of these things, having a separate device that's going to have a better digital to analog converter or something along those lines is important to look into, because ultimately, just like smart TVs, smart receivers have to put this stuff in here, but they're going to probably buy the stuff as cheap as possible so they could say, hey, this thing's smart, right?
Yep.
But if you want to stream, get yourself a Blue Sound node or a Rune or a Sonos port or whatever it is that you want to do to stream the audio to get that better sound quality versus just using what's in the amp.
Yep.
Or AV receiver.
Well, and there is, like I've seen on a lot of them, like AirPlay is built in, and you'll see on a lot of them Alexa or Google Home or any of those technologies are built in. And here I would really tell folks, those are truly secondary. There's not a nicer way to say it. It's not that it doesn't work. Yeah, it may work, and it may work for a short time, but that's probably the least thought of portion of that particular unit. So, you know, it's one of those things that you always have like 2 or 3 steps. You know, I got to open this app, and then I got to go do this thing, and then I got to turn it on, and I got to make sure it's synced. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's actually not a more convenient solution, even though it's built in and it does it, right? It's something that you're going to have to probably have a couple extra steps to do. So,
Yep.
well, awesome. Awesome. I think we've covered it. So we will say thank you for listening to The Sound of Design
With Mark
and Dan. Click subscribe. Go ahead and ring the bell. Drop us some comments. That stuff really does help to keep this thing going. Like, comment, and share with your friends. If you guys have questions, feel free to reach out to us at thesoundofdesign.com. And look for some upcoming episodes. We've got a ton more guests that are slated to come on, so just be on the lookout for that. And we've got some other things in the works. We're very, very excited about heading into the new year as well. So we really appreciate it. We will see you on the next episode.
See ya.